Hello, everyone. So today we'll be continuing with literature liberation, that is a feminist movement. So this is a very interesting module which talks about feminism, the evolution of feminism. So we'll be discussing it as waves: the first wave of feminism, second wave of feminism, and third wave of feminism. But before we get into the waves, just to give you an idea as to how it all began. So the author begins by telling us that if you look at any great period or event, whether it is political or social, you would find that such a period or an event would be connected to some kind of literary creativity. So you would find there is a sort of a connection between great political and social movements as well as literary creativity. So this is not something, it's not a coincidence, it is not a casual parallel. You find that political and social movements are inseparably intertwined with the literary, I would say, output of an age. So the best example would be the French Revolution, because that is an event, of course, a political event which had social, I would say, repercussions. And you would find that it is in the same period that you would find a lot of literary works that were created. So it would seem as if these exist on three different planes, but not really. You would have to understand that they are inseparable. And you find that women's movement, since its birth, it has been, giving birth to literary works. It has been, popularized by the literature it associates with. And you find that, unlike all the other events, other social, I would say, processes or phenomena, the struggle of women has always relied on literature. Because when we talk about women's literature, the main agenda would be to fight against the patriarchal society. So when you fight against the underlying ideology that exists in society, it is not often accepted. And you find that such struggles, I would say, problems of women are always met with a hostility. So for women, the only, I would say, vehicle, some way they could express themselves was through literature. So it was the only available vehicle for self-expression. So you find that there is a close link between women's movement and the literature. So when we talk about women's movement, it is a women's movement which understood that knowledge was power. And this knowledge, where does it exist? It exists in language. And if you, look around us, if you examine the past, the history, you'd find that women's voices, they have been silenced, or it has been distorted, or made trivial for centuries. So you cannot really rely on any other form of literature except poetry. Because in poetry, you would find the apt tool, it's the apt vehicle for exploring this, meaning making process of language, because it is quite dynamic, it is always in a state of flux. And you find it is poetry which seems to be, a perfect receptacle for challenging the dichotomies that exist in society. So there is a separation of the private and the public spheres. There is a split between emotion and intellect. And you'd find that all this is dealt with or is possible to be explored only via poetry. So now when we talk about the growth of feminism, like I said, we always talk about feminism in waves. So before we begin talking about feminism in waves, we have to understand that feminism did not begin all at once. In the beginning, like when you start a fairy tale, you would say once upon a time. Similarly, it began with the individual voices of protest. So before there was an organized, unified launch of a struggle, before the waves, there was actually individual voices of protest. For example, you have this poetry of this Latin American nun. Now, she was aware of the patriarchal society, the patriarchal structure of society, and how it represses women. So, in her poetry, in her verse, she did express her, I would say, dissatisfaction, and her poetry was a form of rebellion. So, she talks about this continual subjection of women to male authority and this, the acceptance of passivity, because women are, they accept that this is how they're supposed to exist. So she goes against this notion of, rather, um, I would say, meek acceptance of passivity as some sort of, fate, that they are destined, and instead, see women as something, as a group of, a group that has this potential for creativity. And you find that her own life illustrated the condition of women better than her verse. But then, of course, this was seen as provocative, controversial writing. And this, of course, had problems in the Orthodox society. And she was literally forced to keep quiet for the rest of her life. Now, coming to the next very, I would say, powerful voice would be that of Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, when you talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, you have to understand she was one of the forerunners of women's agitation for liberation. And her work, this is one work, girls, that you'll have to really study and remember the entire title. It's called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. So this particular work is considered a seminal treatise on the literary repertoire of the movement. So what is it all about? So in this work, you would find Mary Wollstonecraft talks about the exclusion of women from the domain of rights. Women have always been kept away from the domain of rights. Now, this work also speaks against the discrimination that women are subjected to. And above all, this work addresses that suppression of their talent by confining women to the stifling sphere of domestic life is not fair. So this is not something that she took up lightly. This is something that, she's been observing all around her. So she points out the injustice, the stupidity, the absolute absurdity of pushing women to the margins of social life. Now, she takes up this idea of enlightenment. Now, what exactly is enlightenment? If you look at the philosophy of enlightenment, especially in France, the basic idea is fraternity, freedom, liberty. But then, even though it recognizes the worth of human beings, you would find that enlightenment was not meant for women. If enlightenment speaks about fraternity and liberty, what about women's liberty? What about their rights, their privileges? So she realized that there is a sort of a differential treatment of women. You are all born human beings, you're born in the same manner, but women are treated differently. Even when you talk about such a great philosophical movement like enlightenment, men are entitled to enjoy natural rights, but women are not. Where is the enlightenment there? And she realized that this masculine bias, that men are different from women, men are superior to women. This idea is entrenched in the very psyche of women. You would find that it is embedded into the psyche of society. Now, when I say society, I mean men. And you find that it operates in every single aspect of society. Now, the very best example which has been laid down for you is this report on education submitted by this person called, I'm sure you can see it over here, Perigord Talleyrand. So now this report, which is submitted by Perigord Talleyrand to the National Assembly of France, basically tells you about this prejudice which exists in society among men and women. So now, when you read it, you understand that this report only talks about education for men, only for men. But what about women? When it comes to women, it recommends home education, private education for women at home. That is more than sufficient. Because, of course, women are only expected domestic happiness because they have their duties as, daughters and sisters and wives and not anything else. So they have this destiny to fill. So this work of Mary Wollstonecraft is a sort of a reply to this idea that the report suggests, that education should only be given to men, that is public education. Women need not be given any form of serious education. So this vindication of rights of women is a response to this report and is a reply to the work of Talleyrand. So what does it talk about? So she says in this work that the current practice of denying women opportunities of self-fulfillment, of depriving them of benefits of education, is fraught with danger. She says, you're training women in what? You're training women in occupations like singing and sewing, as if they are not capable of serious thought. They are not capable of reasoning or logic. When you do that, she says, you are crippling the progress of humanity, because then it is as if you are telling a woman you are nothing more than an ornament. So what happens is that when women are assigned such trivial, such flippant roles, then you find that this becomes her established role. She will not be, since she's not expected to move out of this role, you'd find that such a woman, whether she is a wife or a mother, once you become a mother, you are entrusted with the task of bringing up your children. And when you bring up your children, how are you going to bring them up? Because you are not being educated, you are not educated, you are only taught singing and sewing. Then how can you, as a mother, teach your children the importance of education or logic or reasoning for that matter? So it is a discourtesy, it is a crime not educating women, because women are the ones who bring up children. So if you are unfit to receive education, then how are you fit to bring up children? And then she says, other than this idea, you have to understand it is inhuman. It is a blatant instance of inhumanity to deny a segment of, we women belong to a segment. So we women are a segment, and to deny us this right for education, it is wrong. So you find Mary Wollstonecraft, she attacks this belief that women are only concerned with trivialities, that they are incapable of rational thought. She says that this is only a sort of a bias of men or the patriarchal society. So you find Mary Wollstonecraft, she understands this ideological nature of society. And then, she counters this concealed bias that exists in society. And then I quote, this is page 56, girls. When men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves, be it not inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women? When men say that they want freedom, they want to be liberated, is it not wrong on their part to subjugate women? When you want freedom, but you don't want another person to enjoy freedom, it is not right. And now she talks about this apparent inferiority in point of rational thinking. It is the outcome of an age-long denial of education to women. Now, the fact that women are inferior is not because women are inferior in any way. Women think of triviality only because that is the only thing that they are taught. It is because of the fact that for ages they have been denied education. That is the only reason why they are inferior. It is not an indication of inherent defect, meaning naturally they are not born defective. Who? Women. Women are as good as men. It is only because they do not receive the same kind of education that there is an inferiority. There is a difference between men and women. So the best example would be this. The Victorian perception of women's role is embodied in the manuals of good conduct for girls. So during the Victorian period, what a woman is, what a woman's role is embodied in these things called manuals. Nowadays, when you buy electronic goods, when you buy an air conditioner or a fridge for that matter, you get a manual, right? Which tells you how to use that particular appliance. Similarly, during the Victorian period, you find there were certain manuals that were brought up. And these manuals basically told women how they ought to think or behave. So I'm going to give you the example of Sarah Stickney Ellis. Now, you find she has authored a series of books, and these are very interesting. Look at the titles of these works: The Wives of England, The Daughters of England, The Women of England. Are there no men? So, if you can see the titles, this is what it basically means: the wives of England, their relative duties, domestic influence, and social obligations. So, it's almost like how you ought to be, how as a wife you're supposed to behave in your house and in society. So, Daughters of England, again, it's very interesting how to behave, how to contribute to the felicity of domestic life. This is what these works basically tell us. So, and then of course, there is this also very interesting work called Mrs. Beaton's instructions on household management. This again, I believe, is available now online. If you can simply look at it, the first few pages would show you how to place table, how to make certain kind of dishes, how to manage economy, in how to buy things, how to reduce income, how to save money. And so this is what Mrs. Beaton's work is all about. And you find that these manuals and these books, they served a particular purpose. They built an image of women. So you find that it's almost like a moral guide. And what happened when women bought these books? They were given proper training. They were given a sort of an idea that this is how women ought to be. And if you are not, then there is something wrong with you. So again, it is an indirect way of subjugating them, repressing them. So you find it created an image of what a right woman, what a proper woman ought to be. So these moral guides restricted and suffocated the women of the 19th century. And you find Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of Right of Women. She wrote it so that, it becomes a sort of a challenge to such works like these, which, create and propagate the distorted stereotype of womanhood. So when you take up Wollstonecraft's treatise, it is seen as a bold articulation of women's protest against discrimination just because you are born a woman. You are discriminated in society only because of your gender. So now after the vindication of the rights of a woman, was Marion Reed's A Plea for Women. Now, this is the next individual work that we need to consider before we move on to the waves. So, this is one of the most popular books after the vindication. So, this book, it discusses the issues that preoccupied the reformers, the early reformers of the 19th century. So she analyzes her contemporaries, and she talks about women's fear. And she equates womanliness with the renunciation of self. So what exactly is this, renunciation of self? What exactly is this womanly behavior? So a womanly behavior in practice means if you are a good woman, if you are a perfect woman, you would behave in a certain manner. And what is that certain manner? You would be very happy and you would be very attentive to your husband. You would keep your children very neat, clean, well fed. And then You would attend to all the domestic needs in your house. That would make you an ideal woman. Okay, so she discusses about all these problems, all these idealizations. So Reed, she, understood the gravity of the problem that women were facing. And what was it? You cannot be independent. You are not allowed to express yourself. If you try to be independent, immediately you are subjugated, you are repressed. And what happens to these young girls? You end up looking like machines, automations. Now, you have to understand Marion Reed, she belongs to one of the early reformers. So, even though you cannot call her, a, a complete feminist, because you find that Reed, she does say that women may not be equal to men. Some subordination to men is natural. But she says that women need to have equal rights along with men. And then she points out the problems. She points out the problems of married women. Now, what are the problems of married women? Back in the day, you find that it is pitiable because they did not really have any rights. They did not have right over their property. Whatever the father gives to the daughter will go to the husband, not to them. And whatever they earn, they can sell eggs, sell their chickens or whatever. The money that they get from running a farm in the house, all that money is not theirs. They have to hand it over to their fathers or to their husbands. So whatever they earn is at the disposal of their husbands. And when it came to their children, of course, women give birth, but despite giving birth to children, a mother has absolutely no right to her children. All the decisions about the children are made uh, by the men in the family and not by the women, especially not the mother. So you find Marion Reed, even though she does not really see a need for having women representation, that is in politics, she points out that women are qualified. They are qualified to get elected to the parliament. So there is a need. Now we're coming to the next very interesting couple. So their contribution also made a huge difference and did have an impact on the wave, the first wave, which we will be studying very soon. So that would be Harriet Taylor Mill and John Stuart Mill. So as you can see, a wonderful couple and their husband and wife, and both of them, they were advocates of the rights of women, and their combination, their liaisons, eh, of course, gave rise to a lot of controversies, but they carried on with their work. Now, Harriet's work was the enfranchisement of women, and John Stuart Mill's work was on the subjugation of women. Now, both these works were extremely influential because they, of course, supported Wollstonecraft's idea of women's right, and they modified it to a certain degree. Now, how did they modify it? Now, what they said was, of course, women should get educated, women should occupy themselves with work outside home. Now, of course, Harry did not find professional life incompatible with maternity. Now, earlier on, there is this idea that once you become a mother, you cannot work elsewhere. So, Harriet, of course, she came with the idea that professional life has nothing to do with your maternity. So, Hill makes the point that this notion of womanliness is because of the hardships that women, were subjected to. And if you give them education, you'll find that they become intellectual as men. So, of course, they had a lot of problems because they tried to fight for the rights of women. And of course, there were the writers like activists like Carolyn Norton, because she fought legal battles because she wanted to change the marriage laws, which were extremely oppressive, like right to property, the limited custody of children. And of course, Carolyn Norton, she's actually the granddaughter of this Irish playwright Paul Sheridan. So, of course, she personally had a disastrous marriage. She was tortured by her husband, and of course, she tried her best to change the oppressive marriage laws. She wanted to, fight for freedom of women. And you find in 1825, William Thompson, he published his appeal. And this is a very interesting title, appeal of on half of the human race, that is us women, one half would be men. So on half of the human race, women, against the pretensions of the other half, men, to restrain them in political and thence in civil and domestic slavery. So now this work he was inspired to write by the career of Anna Wheeler, who divorced her husband, and she brought up her 6 children. She came to England only after the death of her husband. She became well known for her interest in reform. So Thompson's book, it focuses on this miserable condition of married women. A married woman is like a chess, it's like a pawn. It's like she's like a movable property. She's like a servant to man. So this plight of a married woman moved William Thompson, and this particular case of Anna Wheeler moved him, and this is why he ended up writing this book, which has a rather long uh, title. So she reiterates through this work that married women do not really have any right over property or children. And if you really look at it, how are they in any way better than servants? They are no better than servants. And since we're talking about women who really made a difference, from Anna Wheeler, let us move on to Florence Nightingale. Now, Florence Nightingale, let me tell you, girls, she has nothing to do with the women's movement. Florence Nightingale was not really interested in she was not any part of women's movement, but her life and her career tells us, it shows us the benefits of education, because that made her bold. And of course, you know how she contributed to society. Now, Florence Nightingale is believed to have said that if women are unemployed, it is because they are reluctant to work. So she was aware of this, disparity in opportunities available for men and women. Her family actually refused to allow her to work as a nurse. And Florence Nightingale, in her work, she had written this fragmentary novel called Cassandra. In that, she asks, why have women passion, intellect, moral activity, and that too in a place in society where none of the three can be exercised? So it just tells you about the pathetic condition of women. When women are born, we are born with reason. We are born with passion. We are born with moral activity and intellect. But we are born into a society where we are not supposed to use any of these qualities that we are born with. What is the use? And then what happened to Florence Nightingale? Now, this is again a moment of empowerment. Now, in 1853, her father gave her 500 pounds a year. Now, that money gave her freedom to do anything, freedom from domestic tyranny. So from that moment, she worked, she did whatever she wanted to do. So right to property and limited custody of children were granted to women as a result of Norton's tireless legal battle. So Carolyn Norton, thanks to Carolyn Norton, right to property and limited custody of children were granted to women. So this is a huge contribution by Carolyn Norton, who is the granddaughter of the Irish playwright Sheridan. Next, we're coming to the ladies of Langham Place. The ladies of Langham Place. Now, we have to go through the factors which actually brought together these women. Now, the Langham Place group, it was actually a circle of like-minded women, and they all gathered at this particular location, which is the 19 Langham Place. And for a decade, this particular location was the office. From the late 1850s, it was the office of the English Women's Journal. And if you look at the peculiarity of this location, it was essentially a reading room, a coffee shop, and it was also a meeting place where, of course, women gathered and they started talking about education and other things. So they wanted to, intervene in society and they wanted to campaign for reforms. So there was this growing feeling among women that they are being oppressed by male domination. And this, of course, required some kind of intervention. So people who thought like this, women who had the same opinion, they were like-minded, of course, they gathered together in this particular place. And what they did was they began to talk about, issues of urgency like access to education, why it was being denied to women, about employment, how there is inequality in employment, and of course, marriage, reforms of marital law. So you find that whether it is education, whether in the private sphere of women's life, that is education, family, marriage, there was this very clear inequality. When it comes to the public sphere, employment and education, you find that women were denied employment in certain sectors. And of course, education, they were only given primary education. So all these really made them dependent on men. So now these were the women who got together. So these were the ladies of Langham Place. So what these women, what they did was they came together and they began to, talk about uh, women and women issues. So these women, of course, included Emily Davis, Barbara Smith, Anna Jameson, Elizabeth Gaskell, Bessie Rains, Parker. So they began to write uh, very productive pieces. They were clamoring for their right. They were voicing their anger and protest against this discrimination. So now when you talk about Barbara Smith and Bessie Rains Parker, you find that they, of course, wrote a lot. A brief summary of the laws of England. Now, this is a work which actually drew a lot of attention because it explored the inadequacy of the legal system to represent women. And of course, the legal system seemed to be rather harsh and hostile towards women. So if you look at the contributions of the ladies of Langham Place, these are essentially the things that they were able to do. That is, the formation of Married Women's Property Committee in 1855. Barbara Smith, she attended the first women's convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The English Women's Journal was formed, and this was a major step because this was where they could bring forward their ideas. And the formation of SPEW. SPEW is a society for the promoting the employment of women. And this was also one of the outcomes or contributions of the Langham ladies. And of course, SPEW started a lot of branches elsewhere outside London. So all these movements were against barriers to education and employment. So this basically became the backbone of the feminist struggle during this phase. And of course, you find Emily Davis and Elizabeth Garrett. They established more branches of SPEW. And they, of course, also were able to accomplish moderate reforms in education policies. You find the colleges like Queen's College and Bedford College, they began to allow and offer higher education to women. Now, in 1862, Davies got a committee established to persuade universities to allow women to appear for the local examinations. So you find it is Emily Davis and Lee Smith. Together, they were able to, they founded the first higher education institution for women. Later on, this is known as the Girton College of Cambridge. Now, this is established in 1869. So now, of course, you find there are other reforms also, like the Married Women's Property Act in 1882. So these are some of the crowning, I would say, successes of these group of women. One is the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which did allow them to gain property from their fathers, which gave them the right to own property. And of course, you have the repeal of the Contagious Act in 1864. So even Florence Nightingale, she lent her support to the protest against the. Now we're going to understand the events that led to the first wave. So it was basically the struggle for suffrage that marked the high tide of the first wave of women's liberation movement. So there was nothing more shameful than being denied the right of representation in legislature. So there was this very clear, unfair discrimination that existed in society against women, and women were quite angry with this kind of discrimination that was obvious. So it really took time for this very obvious inequality to appear convincing, and you find that women for decades, women were not really ready to join hands with the campaigners. They were not really into activism of any form. But very soon they realized that simply legislative methods will not be enough. And women began to favor quite aggressive tactics. So now talking about the general atmosphere, you find that it was one of open rebellion. There were a lot of committees that were set in various parts of the country because they wanted to struggle, they wanted to fight. So they were coordinating violent forms of struggle. So there was this impending, feeling that something was going to happen. So everywhere women were getting ready to fight for their cause. And you find that the newspapers, they carried this news of an impending storm, but the way in which they carried this news was, almost sarcastically. They were quite cynical. They were mocking women as if women can do anything at all. So to reach out, towards a vast female population, journals were started. So it is only through these journals that you can spread awareness. So uh, when we talk about journals, there are two journals that we need to keep in mind. One is the Women's Suffrage Journal, and the second is the English Women's Review. So you have these two journals coming up, and then there were a lot of meetings, there were a lot of protests. There was this discussion of the issue in the parliament. So you find that these activists, they were quite disappointed by the government's indifference, because the government was not really interested in worrying about women. They were not really, they were not taking these threats, these demands seriously. Because after all, the feeling was, women, after all, what can they do? So you find that it is this indifference, this, I would say, mockery, this cynicism and sarcasm of the patriarchal society, which actually led to a state of despair and frustration, which resulted in a violent outbreak. So you find that the modest phase of petitioning, which was something that women began, soon gave way to militant fights in the early 20th century. Now, when we talk about these militant fights, we need to keep in mind two women, that is Emmeline Pankhurst and, of course, her daughters. Now, you find uh, there was, of course, a lot of debate, there was a lot of criticism from media. There were a lot of retaliatory measures of the government. There were rallies, there were violent clashes with the cops, and even attacks on the official. So, how did women make their claim heard? How did they do it? Now, so it was a militant fight, like I said. So, you find women, they began to make use of very, I would say, creative, rather violent and aggressive tactics. Like they would chain oneself to posts, which basically led to the cops, trying to saw the chains off. And then you find women would, find entry into the parliament, and they would actually climb on the rafters above the parliament, and they would lie on those rafters. They would wait for the parliament to gather, and they would wait for a particular, a specific moment, the apt moment, and then suddenly they would call out threats. They would carry out their slogans and all that. So these women, they were arrested and they were taken to prison. And the scenes in the prison were also quite, I would say, amusing or entertaining now when we think about it. These agitators, these violent protesters, they went on hunger strikes. And because they went on hunger strikes, you find that uh, they were actually forcibly fed. Because if they die in prison, if they die because of their hunger strike, that would get the government in trouble. So they were forcefully fed. And there was this book written by Emmeline, Emmeline Pankhurst's daughters. Now, this book basically spoke about the incidents of one Miss Garrett, who was actually arrested because she bit a wardress because she was trying to feed her. Now, in the 20th century, of course, there was this violent form of activism, but very soon the First World War changed the entire scenario. So, with the First World War, we see men, they were enlisted and they all had to go and fight the war. So, you find during this period, female workforce increased unprecedentedly. So this changed the very demographic composition of the country. So what happened was, by the end of the war, this demand for vote could not actually be postponed, because you find most of these women, they were all working now. So the Representation of People's Act in 1918 actually gave women over the age of 30 the right to vote. And if this was in 1918, 1928, this right was extended to all men and women. So there was electoral reforms which actually gave women to contest in elections. And by 1940, you find that there were 12 women in the parliament. So you find there were a lot of changes. So another important act which you'll have to remember was the enactment of the Sex Disqualification Act of 1990. So earlier on, there was this idea that women were not allowed to, there was this very strict rule that women were not allowed to be part of the civil services. So this Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919 actually was, I would say, an historic event, because this opened up opportunities for women. Women could, be part of the civil service examination, and other professions too were opened up to women. So this is a historic movement. This act is very important. So this is the Act of 1919. It is the Sex Disqualification Act. And then another act, which again is very important, that is the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923. Now, this act is something that women have been waiting for quite some time. This act basically gave them a sort of an equality where both women and men could, divorce. So you find that at the end of this struggle, you find that women were able to, gain some changes. They were able to make some changes. Now, remember, this is before the first wave. The first wave, which happens in the United States, that happens later on. So these are the events which actually led to the first wave. Now, we're going to talk about the first wave in the United States. So this is the first session. In the second session, I'll be taking the first wave and so on.